Hey guys, I hope y'all are having a great week. I know I've been MIA for like 2 weeks, but I'm back and I apologize for that. I'm just starting to finally get in the groove of my schedule, so things have been kind of all over the place, but I'm here. This week I'm going to be talking about basically God's design for sex, and then tying in a couple of other little elements as well that I feel like needed to be touched on. Like for one of the elements I know for sure I'm tying in is masturbation as well. So that's what this video is going to be about. So I hope y'all ready. So I'm going to go ahead and open up with scripture like I normally do. So this scripture for this week is going to be coming from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 verses 3 through 5, and it states, "For this is the will of God, your sanctification, that you abstain from sexual immorality, that each one of you know how to control his own body in holiness and honor, not in passion of lust like the Gentiles who do not know God." So this scripture has a lot in it. It is a long scripture, but it has a lot of information in it that I feel like is very beneficial. You know, it touches on sexual immorality, which I'm going to dive deeper into. It touches on self-control and basically also keeping yourself in a pure state, but also it talks about, you know, the passion of lust and how that's something that people tend to pursue. So we're going to touch on a little bit of all of this, but first off, let's define what sexual immorality is. So sexual immorality is basically interpersonal activity involving sex organs that does not conform to God's revealed laws governing sex or sexuality. Okay, so that is something that I felt like kind of stumped me every time I read verses like this. Anything that had like sexual immorality, I'm like, what does that entail? What does that mean? And it kind of just like stumped me a little bit. So like, you know, I had to actually like look up the definition, like what does that mean? And it's basically saying anything that deals with your sex organs that does not have anything to do with how God designed sex. So then that raises a question like, well, what was God's design for sex? And basically like, why is it like, you know, basically not that serious, but why is it that serious? So basically, let's just talk about, well, first, we're just going to talk about like, you know, what God's design for sex was or is. So basically, sex was designed to bind two souls together. And this is something that I find really, really interesting because as I was doing research and stuff on it, it doesn't not only bind like, you know, you on a physical level, but it binds you on an emotional and a spiritual level as well. And this is something that I feel that is like really, really powerful that I think people may not really completely and totally understand. But there's a scripture in Mark chapter 10 verse 8, and it says and the two will become one flesh. And ultimately, like, that's really what it means. You know, you're basically becoming one. And I think that's something that's really, really important because, you know, if you're connecting, if your souls are being bound on a spiritual, emotional, and physical level, I don't think that's something that you would want to be doing with multiple people. You know what I'm saying? Being bound to multiple people, like that type of connection is something that I feel like is really intense and really powerful, and it speaks volume. But ultimately, as I was doing more research and stuff like that, it was something that really stood out to me. And basically the way that God designed sex and the reason why God wanted us to only have sex with our spouse was because he wanted it to represent his love. And that was something that I just found really interesting. But the way he wanted it to represent his love was in by showing that, you know, being faithful, being committed, the love being unconditional, and the love being permanent. Like, that's what he designed it for, and that's how he designed it to be. And I think that's something that's interesting because, you know, if you look at God's relationship with people, with us, his love is shown in being faithful, being committed, being loving us unconditional, and being permanent. Like, that's a relationship that we have. Whether or not we access that relationship on a permanency level is, you know, between you and God, but ultimately that opportunity is to be permanent for the most part. And so I thought it was really beautiful. Like, that's why I think people say sex is a beautiful thing, because the way God designed it was to be something that represented love, and love is just so beautiful. And you never really realize how much stuff really has meaning to it until you do research. Like, I didn't think sex was really like, you know, that deep. Like, I mean, I know that it's deep as far as a situation of, you know, you two becoming one flesh, but like I didn't know that, you know, that meant connecting on the emotional, spiritual, and physical. I thought it was just a way to bring intimacy into the relationship, and basically, you know, really just making you guys closer in that sense. But for it to be an actual binding of those three elements is something that I feel like a lot of people may not know for real, and that's intense. Like, I think that's something that will cause you to kind of question, like, okay, who am I laying up with? Because I don't want to just be laying up with X, Y, and Z, and these are the type of, like, you know, binds that I'm making, or these like these ties that I'm making to other people, and so that's basically like God's design for sex, and I think that's something that just speaks volume within itself. But basically, how when it comes back to the scripture and it's talking about sexual immorality and basically not having self-control over your own body and like pursuing passions of lust, I can kind of tie that into, like, you know, masturbation, because what is masturbation? It's an act of self-gratification. So one, you're already lacking self-control, and you're also pursuing lust of the flesh, and that's literally what, you know, this scripture is basically warning against. Like, you know, abstain from that, practice holiness, and honor the Lord basically with your body in that sense, and just practicing purity. But not only in masturbation, because the Bible covers a lot of different things, you know, masturbation, adultery, they even cover bestiality. And I didn't think that was like a thing that people were really doing, but that's literally written in the word in Leviticus. Like, people were literally having sex with animals. And that's something that, you know, is covered under sexual immorality, because obviously it involves your sex organs, so that makes sense. But like, I didn't think people were really sleeping with animals. That's really weird. But these different things that violate, like in Leviticus, I believe it's in Leviticus, they were violating and partaking in violating the marriage bed, but also partaking in sexual immorality. And the people were basically punished by death, because they were either punished by death, or they were literally like basically excommunicated from like the rest of the people. So it's like something back then that was something that was very, very, I guess, common. Like, people just didn't understand the true design of sex back then. And I think one of the biggest things is lack of understanding or lack of knowledge concerning those situations. So that's why I really wanted to make this video, so that we could have a little bit of understanding to help us make better decisions concerning sex, concerning you know, the other things that we partake in, whether it's, you know, masturbation, pornography, or whatever. But also another thing too, that as I was researching, something that I came across was basically on one of these things, it was talking about like how God designed sex, but how things could be communicated to the world when you're operating outside of God's design for sex. And so when it was basically saying like for sex outside of marriage, it can convey to the world that commitment is not needed, which once again, you know, like I talked about before, you know, God displaying his love of commitment, faithfulness, you know, unconditional love and permanency. It's showing like, you know, commitment's not needed, and that's false. You know what I'm saying? Because, you know, God shows us commitment, and we should be showing God commitment. So I feel like that's something that, you know, you can kind of be like, okay, like, yeah, I know we don't really care about what people think or say about us. Yes, that's true. That's awesome, whatever. But this is how these things can be communicated to the world. Like when it comes, and it also said like, you know, masturbation, it conveys to the world that relationship is not needed. But we know that God is a relational God. He's very big on relationship, whether it's individual, like relationships like on an intimate level, or relationship with just friendships. He's very big on relationship. So we already know that that's not, it can't be of God, you know what I'm saying? And then also it was talking about pornography, and it was basically saying that, like, you know, when you're like partaking in pornography and stuff like that, that it basically communicates to the world that it's okay to exploit, objectify, and devalue people. And we know that that is not what God does. So I think that was something that was kind of interesting. I know it may not be exactly, you know, related to what I was talking about, but I think it was a nice little tidbit that kind of like stood out to me. So I feel like I should share that with you all. But basically, that's basically God's design for sex. And ultimately, just really keying in on what all is entailed in sexual immorality. I hope that this video was helpful in just bringing a little more understanding and a little more clarity on that situation. And I will see you guys next week. Love y'all, and y'all have a great rest of your week.